In our house this year, during Advent, we have been rereading some of the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. And in The Silver Chair is one of my favourite quotes. It's when the main character, Eustace, says to his friend Jill, he asks her this question: "Are you good at believing things? I mean, things that everyone here would laugh at." Now, obviously, at this time of year, the concept of believing what would normally be laughed at has been wholeheartedly adopted by our culture. Christmas, and especially Christmas Eve, is a time of year when rational thinking is strongly discouraged and imaginations are thoroughly encouraged. But this question of whether or not we are good at believing things that everyone would laugh at, is not just a question for little kids at Christmas time. The question is, as C.S. Lewis meant it, a most serious question. It is a most important Advent question. Because the Christmas story, and I mean the one according to the Gospels and not Coca-Cola, the Christmas story, and indeed the whole Christian life, demands that we be a people that believe what often seems unbelievable. And today's text is no exception. We just have to listen to the opening line of Isaiah chapter 9. "Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who were in distress." I wonder, do we as a church believe these words? Because these are words that I think all of us would really like to believe. And yet when we try to imagine this prophecy of no more gloom for the many people in distress in our world, maybe even for ourselves, I think it's hard for us to think of these words as believable. The extent of bloodshed and suffering and heartache in our world is so great that these words can actually kind of feel like a cruel joke that mocks us. Or maybe at best, just a beautiful, poetic myth. We find it really difficult to imagine a way in which these words, this prophecy, could actually prove true. And it's in our very inability to believe, our inability to imagine an alternative, an inability to see any way out, that causes us the very worst kind of distress. In fact, the kind of distress that Isaiah is talking about here. Because Isaiah reveals to us in these chapters that the darkest distress comes not from terrible circumstances themselves, but the darkest distress comes from being without hope. This is how Isaiah describes the lack of hope. He says, people without hope will look towards the earth and see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into utter darkness. Utter darkness, that's how Isaiah describes the experience of being without hope. And I think many of us are familiar with this feeling. We look at our world and we see only gloom and darkness. Even at this time of year, with lights in our windows and the radio telling us that it's the most wonderful time of the year, even then, we still feel very aware of the darkness. But I have really good news for you this morning, because this prophecy from Isaiah is most definitely for you. So let's have a quick look at what's going on at the time when Isaiah spoke these words. Isaiah was a great prophet and a poet in the Old Testament. So the background story here is that God's people at this point are known as the nation of Judah. And they have a king called Ahaz. Now, Ahaz is a terrible king. He is often seduced by the shiny possessions of his neighbouring nations, and he has greatly diluted the worship of God among God's people. But this king learns one day that two other nations to the north have joined forces and plan to attack Judah and overthrow him as king. The Bible tells us that King Ahaz and all the people shook with fear. They were really terrified. War was coming, and they were hard-pressed on every side. But just at this time, like a great movie, God sends the prophet Isaiah with a message for King Ahaz. And the message is this: that King Ahaz is to trust in God and not in the powers of this world in the face of this threat. And God says these very gracious words to King Ahaz. He says, "Listen carefully. Be quiet. Be still. Do not fear, and do not let your heart faint because of these enemies." God says their plan shall not stand, it shall not come to pass. And he tells Ahaz to stand firm in the faith, or he will not stand at all. He says, if you do not hold fast, you will not be held fast. So God's people are being asked to trust God and his word, that they need not fear, despite what it looks like. They're being asked to let God's voice be the loudest voice in their heads and in their hearts. And then God goes even further and grants Ahaz this very surprising grace. He invites Ahaz to ask God to prove it. He says, "Ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as the heaven." This is really amazing. God is actually asking or inviting Ahaz to have a tangible sign that he need not fear these enemies. And you'd think that that was something completely irresistible. But very shockingly, Ahaz declines God's offer. He says, "Oh, no, God, I couldn't possibly ask that." And he cloaks his rejection of God's sign in very spiritual language, but he rejects it nonetheless. Instead, Ahaz has already decided in his heart what he is going to do. He is not going to listen to the words of God. He is not going to trust God. And instead, he is leaning and trusting in his own plan, which is a collusion with the empire of Assyria. Now, Assyria was kind of the superpower of the day. So Ahaz is kind of shaking hands with the strong military powers of his world. But I was thinking, we're not really that different, are we? Because in our fear, we often also grasp at anything other than God to save us. If we're really honest, we find the idea of trusting in and waiting on God kind of laughable. We find it weak and naive and foolish and maybe even a bit embarrassing. We think in our hearts, surely we must do something. Surely we must armour up and prepare for battle in one way or another. We find endless ways to try and control and manipulate, and we grasp at all sorts of straws. Here in this story, God had promised Ahaz that he need not fear other nations, that somehow God would thwart the plan of the enemy. But this promise seemed too unbelievable to Ahaz, or maybe just too laughable. Ahaz wasn't convinced, nor importantly did he want to be convinced, and so he refused God's sign of promise. But here is God's surprise to us. Because even though Ahaz refused God's tangible sign of promise, God gave it anyway. God gave it anyway, and this time he gave it to the whole people of Judah, in other words, to the whole people of God, which, by the way, we are a part. And the sign is one very familiar to us, especially at this time of year. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. The sign of hope that God offers his people in the face of their suffering is a newborn baby named Emmanuel, which means God is with us. The baby, of course, is a foreshadow of Jesus, who would one day come to be revealed as the true fulfillment of Emmanuel, and we'll get to that in a moment. But this prophecy right now at this time is 700 years before Jesus is born. And it is also partially fulfilled in this time too. There was at this time a baby that God called upon his people to receive as a sign of hope that God was with them and would protect the nation from total destruction. Some people think It was maybe Ahaz's own son, Hezekiah, who would one day actually be a good king. Or some people think maybe it was Isaiah's son. We don't know. But we do know that it was a child and not a huge army, which was probably what was on their Christmas list. A child and not a huge army was what God used to summon his people to faith and hope that he was with them. This newborn baby is a very sharp contrast to what they thought they needed. It was a sharp contrast to the military powers with which Ahaz is colluding and to the threat that they faced. God is demanding that his people let a newborn baby awaken their hope. This fragile newborn baby, and not mighty kings or warriors or power or money. I'm sure it seemed as absurd to them as it does today, but it remains just as true. This sign of God's presence was given to steady their hearts amidst terror. It is given, importantly, even though God's people are ignoring it, and even though they're out and out rejecting it. But in contrast to Ahaz, we have the prophet Isaiah. And Isaiah is summoned not to walk in the way of the people. He is supposed to be a contrast to them in the sense that he is to cling to God, which is what they were failing to do. In chapter 8, God tells Isaiah, "Do not walk in the way of this people. Do not call conspiracy all that this people calls conspiracy. And do not fear what it fears or be in dread. But the Lord of hosts, him you shall regard as holy. Let him be your dread." So Isaiah was to hold on to the sign given and the word spoken by God. And when Isaiah hears these words, he orders that the testimony and the teaching be bound up and sealed. Now, this act of writing down the prophecy and the teaching and binding it and sealing it was sort of a symbolic act. It was a way of saying, this word is from God, and I trust it will be fulfilled. The scroll would be kept bound until the day of its fulfillment, and then the seal would be broken and it would be opened. So when Isaiah cries, bind up the seal, bind up the testimony and seal the teaching, it's his way of saying, I trust that what God has said will come true. Isaiah is believing God's promise that he is with them and they need not fear, despite what it looks like. And even though there is war and oppression and death, and even though it feels as though God is hiding his face, Isaiah says these very powerful contrasting words. I will wait for the Lord, who is hiding his face. I will hope in him. This is the eager, expectant waiting and hope of Advent. And it's right after these words that Isaiah tells us that any who continue to insist on trusting in the powers of this world rather than in God's promise will be a people who have no dawn. They will be in darkness. They will go about greatly distressed. They will look up and down, see only darkness and gloom, and they will be thrust into utter darkness. Are you starting to see? The utter darkness that people experience when they do not wait on God or trust in him is not a punishment from God. It's just a natural consequence. Because without God, there really is no hope. He is our only dawn. The wonderful poet W.H. Auden writes these words, "Nothing can save us that is possible. We who must die demand a miracle." You see, Auden gets it. He understands that sin and death cannot be overcome by human determination, human capacity, or human moral resolve. Nothing possible can save us. The only thing that can save us from all that causes us distress is essentially impossible. We need a miracle. That's what makes us feel despair and feel hopeless when we look at our lives and our world. It's the deep down knowledge that all of us have that we are unable as humans to solve the problem of death and all of its friends, no matter how hard we try. But here's the thing, as Fleming Rutledge also says, it is precisely where our faith in mankind ends that the Christmas message begins. Because the truth of the real Christmas story is that we do have a miracle. The question is, are you good at believing things? Things that everyone here would laugh at. Because our miracle, the miracle that gives us hope in the gloom of this world, is a newborn baby, born in Bethlehem over 2,000 years ago. Our miracle is this Emmanuel. Or as Luke puts it, and I love the way he phrases it, by the tender mercy of our God, the dawn has broken upon us. Because of this miracle, this Emmanuel, this baby, this dawn, the people who walked in darkness, in other words, the people who had no hope, have seen a great light, whether they know it yet or not. To those with their eyes closed, to those with no hope, the light has nevertheless come, because we have a God who gave his sign anyway. And for this reason, Isaiah is able to make the ridiculously audacious statement that nevertheless there will be no more gloom for those who are in distress. And we believe this, we do believe this, not because we have faith in humanity, but because unto us a child really is born. Because unto us here today, this son really is given. This baby is God's miracle gift to us. And it probably isn't anything like what we think we need or want when we look at the darkness of our world. But yet, it is everything we need and want. Because it is through this baby, born a child and yet a king, that God himself has come to us. This vulnerable baby is the way that God has chosen to intervene in our broken world, to set in motion a cosmic undoing of death and sin. This poem in Isaiah 9 was written to announce the possibility of spectacular newness through a new king in the line of David. But it is only this king, Emmanuel, that can fulfill the calling of this poem. Because only on his shoulders does all power and authority rest. He is the only king able to rule with perfect justice and righteousness, which will put all the wrong things right in the end. He is the most wonderful counselor and truly the Prince of Peace. He will establish welfare for all people with no exceptions or exclusions. He will rule as our gentle shepherd and loving father, leaving none as orphans. Under his rule and under his care, all war tools will be disarmed and turned into gardening tools so that they will never again be used for death, but only to nurture life. His ways of ruling will render all that we armour ourselves with in the face of threat utterly useless. The currencies of money and power and strength and warfare will be worthless in this new age to come. And under his rule, we will live in perfect peace, because he, as our mighty God, does have the power to thwart every enemy. He shatters the burdens, all that burdens them, and he overthrows their darkest oppressor. And he is the only king that will reign forever. So this is why we can join with Isaiah and proclaim that there will one day be no more gloom. Because this Jesus really is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and he is good. And the full realization of his kingdom, which we await, is the truest and ultimate reality for all situations of gloom, past, present, and future. Because God has spoken it, it will come to pass, and it is now approaching us. Not because of anything we have done or not done, but because his own zeal, his own passion, will accomplish it. This new age to come has already been inaugurated in the birth of this Emmanuel, though many did not notice him. And it will be fully realized when he comes to us again, which we await. His rectifying power will ripple through all the earth and through all of time, and when it does, we will rejoice. We will rejoice with abundant feast, and we will say together that our God has done great things. So, I invite you today to look distress in the face and weep, because it really is our calling and a form of repentance and worship to do so. But in your weeping, say the word nevertheless, because what our eyes see today is not the end of the story. And our action and activity on this earth to care for each other in situations of gloom is the way that we as Christians tell the rest of the world how the story is going to end. We do not bring the end. We do not bring God's kingdom, but we most certainly do proclaim it. We proclaim its reality and its coming. The sign has been given to us. The gift of this baby has been given to us, so we are never again in the dark about how things are going to end, and we need never again feel hopeless. We really are a people who have much reason to believe things that many would laugh at. So lift up your heads and say with Isaiah, I will wait for the Lord, and I will hope in him. I'll finish with these words from Habakkuk. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it seems to linger, wait for it, because he will certainly come and will not delay. May this be our hope now and until he comes again. Amen.